can see on the screen. But all of the questions that I'm going to present are through this lens of sensory ecology. And that basic idea is that we can understand the world better if we look through the lens of other animals. That not only can we understand amazing individual interactions like this one, but we can understand lots of knockoff consequences of those interactions. How are communities assembled? How are ecosystems constructed? And what are the evolutionary paths of organisms? Because it's important to realize that the world we see is not the world that the rest of wildlife see. So we can't see the ultraviolet component of this flower. And we have to use an artist to help us imagine what a honeybee might see with its 3 cones, let alone the 4 cones of a hummingbird eye. And this basic idea is old, the idea of an Umwelt, that animals have a self-centered world, and the information available to them is structured through their sensory systems. And that basic idea comes up in animal communication, which is a field that was kind of codified in the 90s, but it really focused on sender-receiver relationships, typically a male songbird singing to a mate. But it was in also the 90s that sensory ecology was first sort of formally presented by Duesenberry in 1992. And the thesis was the same as Utzkel's from long ago, that there are larger consequences for this flow of information through systems, and that a single songbird that's singing is simultaneously listening to all the males that he might be rivals with, and listening for other cues of information, and the female is doing the same thing. These networks. And there's even a textbook now, Sensory Ecology, Behavior and Evolution by Martin Stevens. And this class, I teach it here at Boise State. It's taught at Purdue, Dartmouth, a handful of schools around the country, and dozens of universities in Europe all teach courses on sensory ecology now. And I think bats and moths are a great way to look at this field, because I have to pull these frequencies down for you to be able to hear them and see those amazing double backflips, because we don't have access to that animal sensory world. Another amazing thing going on in the bat world are the insects that they battle against. And this is a zoom in on the side of an insect's chest, its thorax. So when these animals hear bat echolocation, they make that crazy sound. And sometimes they advertise to bats that they taste bats. You can hear the moth sounds. And then once the bat has gained experience, like this little red bat, they'll no longer approach that prey. All of this happening within their sensory channels. And at really high sound presentation rates, some of these moths are even capable of jamming bat sonar. You can hear the moth sound, preventing the bat from being able to localize that prey item. And we've shown this not just in the tiger moths that I presented, but also in a wholly different family of moth sphinges. And these moths make sound back at bats with their butts. So this is the tip of their abdomen sticking up, and those things that are fluttering are modified claspers, genital claspers, which led magazines in the UK to say that scientists discover that moths jam bats with their junk, which is a very off-color title. But true, it turns out that this behavior was not described before because it was entirely ultrasonic. Moth makes sound, jam the bat sonar, and then miss it. And in subsequent work over the last about 6 or 7 years all around the world, my colleagues and I have found that it's not just these two groups. It's not just tiger moths and sphinges. But when we play back recorded bat echolocation attacks out of a speaker, when we're holding a moth in front of it, we find that all kinds of different groups produce these sounds. So this is a phylogeny of Lepidoptera, and you can see that it is widespread across the entire group, completely undiscovered communication going on. And you can see that there's lots of different ways of making it. I won't spend much time on this. Some groups, like pyralids, use a wing coupling mechanism, and they beat the wing back and forth across it. Other groups use specialized patch of scales on their abdomen. Still other groups use these two pocketed tymbals between the thorax and the abdomen, and they fire sound back at the bat like alternating guns. And what we find across all of these different origins is that most of the time the moths don't make enough sound to jam sonar based on the data we have. But when we feed these moths to bats, and we use a control moth to make sure that animal is willing to eat. This rhinolophid in Mozambique thought that one was delicious. And now here in a minute, I'm going to present a sound-producing moth that we think might not taste good, and the bat seems to agree. It does not taste good. So it seems that this widespread anti-bat ultrasound production represents likely the largest acoustic mimicry complex on Earth. We're still working on this, but it really seems like the animals are advertising bad taste or pretending to do so. And because of the diversity of Lepidoptera, 1 in 10 animals on Earth, these could be the largest mimicry rings out there. In other diversity work, we've looked at these types of moths and bat interactions with them. And they clearly have these really beautiful tails, but often they arrive at your light where we catch these insects missing a tail. And it turns out that those tails rotate behind the moth. They create an acoustic target that diverts the bat attack, and the moths get away to live another day. The tails usually don't break off, but sometimes they do, and the moths are fine. They still fly fine. But I showed these videos just to be really evocative. And so you have this animal that has these long tails specifically crafted to reflect sonar to look like a viable target to the moth. And they've evolved multiple times in the family, once in South America, once in Asia, once in Australia, and once in Africa. And one of the things we've done is look at the entire shape space of these animals and then map that shape space on phylogeny to see how many different times these different shapes have evolved. Then we recreated those shapes by cutting and gluing wing material on moths, which, because they get damaged all the time and birds and bats bite off pieces of them, they're very well adapted to dealing with this. Made sure those shapes we made fit within biological reality, and then pit those elongated shapes to bats. And it turns out that not only does phylogeny indicate that this is under selection, but bats are diverted more frequently the longer the tails. And that's what I'm showing here. And so all of that really fast data is just to say that the world is full of amazing stories that we can only discover if we look through the senses of other animals, if we try to structure the information through their lens. And what I'm showing here on the screen is a conception of a niche, or a niche, as you might say. And it's that simple idea that there are conditions in which an animal can survive best, in which that population will persist. And typically those are thought of as things like the temperature profiles, rainfall, elevation. But the argument I'm going to make today is that sensory environments are another axis in this multidimensional niche space. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the acoustic environment, or the soundscape. And this is another field of study that really benefits from a sensory ecology perspective. So on the screen here, we have a sound picture. And this one is a 24-hour spectrogram. Now, you have frequency on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal, and we've got 12 rows, 2 hours per row, so it's a whole day, 24 hours. And the coloring is how intense is the sound. And so you can see that there's some wind noise in there, but essentially there's no sound in this recording from Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska. And it's these kinds of conditions, these incredibly quiet acoustic environments in which life evolved. And some of the most remarkable animal behaviors occur, like being able to plunge through 2 feet of snow, just hearing the footsteps of a vole. But that world is going away. This is a recording from Rocky Mountain National Park. And you can see that it is just covered in some kind of signature. And that signature is traffic noise. This is one of the only 3 roads over the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. So it's used as a highway. It's not just for seeing the national park. And you can see that almost the entire day is swamped with noise. And if we make some basic assumptions, every 3 decibels that the background sound level increases, an animal's listening area decreases by 50%. So not much of a change that in some conditions humans can barely notice reduces our listening area by 50% as well. So just in a 9 dB increase, this bird's world is dramatically shrunk. And that can have some real consequences. In the lab, we've taken pallid bats, which are gleaners that catch big prey like scorpions and centipedes off the ground. And we've asked them, how can you hunt in these kinds of noise environments? And we found that across sound levels, search times double. And for an animal that is often living on the edge in body condition, taking twice as long to find food could have real consequences. Although we don't know from this study, it's a laboratory study of a remarkable beast. We catch these just outside of Boise. They're all over the Sage Steppe out here in the West because that country is also covered with scorpions, their favorite prey. We've done similar work with saw-whet owls, asking them how they hunt in noise. And we've discovered they're bloodthirsty killers, and they're incredibly cute. And when you present them with loud sound levels, in this case from compressor stations in natural gas extraction fields, which blanket much of the boreal forest across Canada and Russia, you see that the probability of their ability to detect a mouse, strike at a mouse, and eventually succeed dramatically decline as the sound level increases. And this is maybe not surprising based upon basic biology. If you give mice a choice of what substrate to walk on, they will choose the quietest. If you play the wing beat sounds of the frog-eating bat back to a frog, they will run away. If you play the footstep sounds of an approaching predator to begging chicks, they'll stop begging. So even though we don't listen anymore, because it doesn't really affect our success in life, we can walk around with headphones in and there's almost no consequence. The rest of the world, the rest of the animal world, is listening. And maybe where this is most explored is in birds and songbirds. And there's a rich literature that hypothesizes that bird song is shaped to transmit through particular environments in certain structural ways, in the way the birds sing. And that literature is actually pretty mixed. But where it is strongest is in response to anthropogenic noise. So this is an example of one of those studies where songbirds are shifting the way they sing in noise. So this is one of the first studies that came out in a 10 of 10 city forest comparison in Europe. And so here is a call in the forest outside of Brussels. And here is a call in the city. So you can see these birds are raising the minimum frequency of their calls, and they're increasing redundancy of the calls while shortening the duration a bit to increase that redundancy. The same thing we do in a busy, crowded bar. Sometimes you say the same thing more than once to be heard. You talk louder, which often has a sort of byproduct of raising the frequency of your voice. And again, this pattern of a louder world, which is, it seems to be affecting birdsong, is happening all over the place. So this is another 24-hour spectrogram of Lake Mead Recreation Area. And this was recorded a long way away from the lake, so those aren't motorboats. Instead, they're helicopters on their way from Las Vegas to Grand Canyon to get on more helicopters and small planes to fly over the Grand Canyon. 50% of daylight hours, 50% of the Grand Canyon is swamped in anthropogenic noise. And that was a collaborative compromise. And air traffic noise even swamped some of our keystone protected areas. So this is Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. There's a plane taking off from the only airport in the national park. And look at that decibel scale. So compared to the natural ambient, which is somewhere around 25, we're seeing a 50 decibel increase as those planes fly over in some places. And remember what a 9 decibel increase does to how far an animal can hear? So at least for these moments, we have some really dramatic loss in listening area. And for animals that vocalize in very low frequencies like grouse and frogs, those might even be affected at scales that we're only beginning to understand. This is a 24-hour spectrogram of Yosemite National Park, far in the backcountry. And all of those signatures are high-flying jets on their way into the San Francisco Bay Area. 70% of daylight hours, there is a high-flying jet in Yosemite. And it's the #1 complaint of backcountry users is sleep disruption from jets. And we don't really know what these frequencies do, but we know that they are ubiquitous. So this is an animation from an artist at UCLA of 1 day's commercial-only air traffic in the United States. So you'll see the East Coast wake up here and move west. But one noise source we do know a lot about is car traffic noise, roadway traffic noise. This is a spectrogram of Grand Teton National Park in 2013 on one of the quieter roads. So each one of those individual lines is a car pass-by event. And this is a dirt road. And this is the day before the government shut down in 2013. And this is the day after. And believe it or not, back in the day, this was considered a dysfunctional government that they shut down for a few days. Clearly things have changed. But this is what a protected area should look like in my mind, if we consider noise pollution and a type of pollution that we are worried about. And in fact, 83% of the land in the United States is within 1 kilometer of a major road. And this is an animation of a vehicle going up the Going to Sun Road in Glacier National Park, and that's an almost 5-mile sound footprint. So road ecology, studying what roads do to wildlife, is a very rich discipline. Decades of great work, hundreds of studies, indicating that birds avoid roads at least a kilometer per bird. Populations decline. Many mammals decline within 5 kilometers of a road. But what is it? Is it direct collisions? Is it chemical pollution, visual disturbance, noise? So in order to try and suss that out, we created what we call the phantom road. And we did this in the interface between the sage steppe and the coniferous forest right outside of Boise here in Idaho. And along that interface is mountain shrubland, which is an incredibly important habitat for migrating birds in this part of the world. And that's what we're focused on in this study. So these birds' only job is to pack on fat to make a huge leap from this edge of the forest, moving down here, moving south, across a huge treeless expanse over the Snake River Birds Great Conservation Area, which is the highest density of nesting raptors known in North America. So an incredibly dangerous place for a songbird. So we partnered with the Intermountain Bird Observatory, which is that little house there in the middle. You can see Boise down to the left. And we monitored that long-term site, which has been monitored for over 25 years for all kinds of birds. And we built our phantom road over here, where we lashed speakers to trees, 15 pairs, and then turned it on and essentially created just the noise component of the road. And in fact, we frequently had people, recreationists that were coming by on trails saying, I didn't know I was so close to the highway. It's like, no, you're not. The highway's actually a long ways away, but we made this one. But there's a real strong experimental design problem here. There's one site. And if you learned anything in your intro statistics course is that you have to have some sort of sample size in order to understand if your hypotheses are supported. So in order to get those replicates, we took advantage of knowing how long birds stay at this stopover site, and we turned the noise on and off every 4 days to get independent replicates as the waves of birds went through our site. And what we found was that our control sites and the road site when the noise were off were all about the same. And when we turned the noise on, the control sites bumped a little, but not significantly. But the road site itself, almost 30% of the birds avoided that site. 13 of 22 species overall. And if we drill in and look at some individual species, we can see that some of these avoided the area completely, the red blocks that go all the way to 0. And what that looks like if we zero in on dusky flycatchers is that when the road was off, they were there. We turned it on, they left. Off they came back, on they left. Off they came back. Where at the control site, we got a pretty equal abundance. And we played this phantom road at a pretty quiet level, kind of right in between a quiet suburb and the average office. So it's really showing you that not much sound level can have these dramatic differences, which, remember, I was arguing from a fundamental principle earlier. Most natural environments are below 30 dB, meaning much quieter. We also misnetted almost 10,000 songbirds to look at their body condition. And so that's what we have graphed here, is their body condition over time. And you can see there's an arc across the season, because as migrating birds build up energy across the fall, at a population level, you see this overall increase in body condition. But notice every time we turn the noise on, we're knocking that body condition down. And the way that we are preventing these birds from gaining weight is that we are directly altering stopover efficiency. So their ability to gain weight is on the vertical axis, or their beast body condition index, and then time after sunrise. So imagine these songbirds. Their physiology is so optimized for weight gain in the fall that if they ate 2 bowls of Cheerios in the morning, they might gain 10 pounds, if they were equivalent to us. And so at all of our control conditions, we see this real strong ability to gain weight. But then when we turn the noise on, we knock down their ability to do so. Now, it's not just migration when birds are potentially exposed to noise. The breeding season is also a really important time in a bird's life history. Most mortality occurs in the winter and during migration, but breeding season is, of course, when you get the currency of fitness, offspring. And so to look at that, we synthesized another ubiquitous noise source across the world, and that is compressor stations. So compressor stations are involved in oil and gas extraction fields, and they're engines, house-sized engines that are intimately involved in fracking. So to push all of that fluid down into the ground and maintain pressure in pipelines, these compressor stations are used. And for instance, there is no natural gas field in North America that is not fracked now. There used to be. That is not where we are now. So we took advantage of being able to replicate this point source, a single noise-producing entity, and worked in the stage step where a lot of gas extraction occurs. Used these complicated speaker arrays to, as faithfully as we could, synthesize this noise source, and then we counted songbirds. This was Elifet Pinto Mejia's master's project, and this is a model of the sound she was able to produce, and this is a parameterized and validated model, and you can see that the wind is playing a major role in structuring where that sound is going. And what we find is that the entire sagebrush songbird community responds to this noise, to this gas compressor noise, and that brewer's sparrows in particular, which are a species of special concern in the stage step, respond strongly to noise. We've also taken a larger look at this at the continental scale, so at what we call the conterminous United States. And so this is the lower 48, and what's mapped here is sound level. And this is created by the National Park Service, the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division, and they took 72 geospatial layers, 500 multi-month-long recordings and looked at all of the things that correlate with sound levels, and then used that to extrapolate across the entire lower 48. And this does a pretty damn good job of estimating what the integrated long-term sound level is at any location. And you can see that the eastern U.S. has a lot more noise than the west, as you might expect. And one thing we've done with this data is compare it to the largest citizen science database that currently exists in this country, and that's Cornell's Nest Watch program, which is finding nests and tracking them through until the birds, figuring out when the eggs are laid and when the chicks leave, when they fletch. And we looked at both light and noise today. I'm just going to talk to you about the noise stuff. And what we found were really strong signatures with a lot of uncertainty surrounding those signatures, but definitely going on, that clutches are failing and nest success is declining as it gets louder. Now, an interesting outcome of that mapping exercise from the Park Service was that a lot of the layers they used to create that sound level were vegetation, rivers, topography, soil moisture, and they were able to subtract a natural sound layer. So the layer that we used to compare, to look at all of that data, was what are humans adding to the landscape? And here's what remains. And so this is the natural soundscape, pre-human settlement of the continent. And you can see that, like out here in the Rockies, there's some really loud wind-blown ridges. And then some of these deserts are the quietest places in the continent. And then look at all of this. Anybody privately brainstorming what might be causing these huge sound levels in the east? Whenever I'm giving a talk out here, I always say, who here grew up in the east? And then always some folks raise their hands. I'm like, what do you miss the most? And they always say, the forest. And that's right. It's the deciduous forest and all of the biological choruses that go along with it. Katydids and frogs and songbirds. So it's life and trees that are making it that much louder. What this made my collaborator, Clint Francis, and I think about was, so what are the evolutionary responses to animals to this variation in the acoustic environment? So we set out with a National Science Foundation grant to try and answer that. We called this one the Phantom Rivers Project, because of lack of originality. And we put speakers out all over a chunk of Idaho mountains to try and figure this out. And we played back with whitewater rivers. So we recorded these rivers with really good equipment and then played them back. This next video might be pretty loud. Not too bad. So we recorded these streams and, in fact, also studied these streams to try and figure out what's going on with these natural soundscapes and their structuring of bat and bird distributions. So the basic design is that the phantom river sounds are just playing back whitewater noise and studying the community. But then we took the same temporal profile, the same energy, and shifted it upwards in spectrum. And the basic idea is that if noise is driving species away, if it is a razor that cuts communities apart, if we cut it in two different places, we would have a clean test of that idea. So on the control side over here, these are natural whitewater streams that we studied, from really quiet to really loud. And then over here on the treatments, we took quiet streams and added either the river sounds or the shifted river sounds to them. And these two files, the river and shifted river, were created so that they were equally loud in the perception of the average songbird. So we weighted the energy in these playbacks by the average hearing abilities of songbirds. And then across this mountain range, we distributed these sites and studied them for 2 years, and some of the data is for 3 years. And so we had 7 tons of equipment that we carried into this roadless landscape of speakers and mounts. And we tried to get all this stuff out there before songbirds established their territory. So we'd have a nice, good, clean picture of territory establishment, so that we were catching birds before they were making their decisions. So a lot of the early work was done in the snow. One of our years, we had such extreme runoff and avalanches that it closed the road, and we had to rent teams of mules to get everything up into place in our site. And luckily, the roads cleared, and we became the mules, and we packed everything in and out of these sites for years. And then used solar panels to power these 24/7 for the entire breeding season, up to 3 months a year across this landscape. And if you look at sort of the distribution of our sites, on this side, these are all of our sites when the speakers were off. And so essentially everything is all right about at the same sound level. Now note that these sound levels are already kind of starting to get up there in high levels. So remember, the Phantom Road was 55. So this is just normal river sounds. But then when we added those playbacks, we're pushing those environments up to the levels of our whitewater rivers. So over the course of this work, we observed 73 bird species that we found in 7,000 observations, almost 19 or more than 19,000 visits to each individual point count location. And what we find is really similar to anthropogenic noise, that birds decrease in abundance with sound pressure level. And this is the model output, keeping all other fixed factors constant, and this is the raw data plotted behind. And then over here is a really interesting finding, and that is that if we create this measure called spectral overlap, so we took the dominant frequency of the bird's song and said, how close is it to the main part of the noise in the environment? And what we found is that as overlap approached perfect, there was a decline in birds. So overlap with song was really predictive of whether or not these birds were leaving the area. Now, interestingly, there was this interaction effect. And if you know, you're used to complicated statistics, you probably can interpret this, but I'll use it for work. I'll use some words here that basically at lower sound levels, we found that pattern. But as sound levels got higher and higher, that went away. And at the highest sound levels, overlap with song didn't matter at all. So what it seems is that when the world gets really loud, it's more about other things as well. Perhaps being able to detect prey, detect predators. So to try and tease some of that apart, we looked at foraging and songbirds by putting out thousands of clay caterpillars. And this is a tried and true technique in ecology where you can see what kind of indents are made in the clay. And on here you can see this is the indent that a bird would make. And what we found is that even controlling for bird abundance, so bird abundance is built into this model. So this isn't like another way of looking at the fact that birds left, but those birds that remained still showed this marked reduction in foraging ability. And this again indicates a mechanism that is different from masking. This isn't birds not being able to hear these caterpillars because they weren't moving. They're just clay caterpillars. So this indicates there's some sort of multimodal effect, some attentional cost to being in a loud world and trying to do a visual foraging task. And we also measured bat populations using acoustic detectors. And we detected 12 bat species, over 100,000 bat pass-by events, over 2,200 site nights. And we find a strong decline with sound level in bat activity, and also this really strong relationship with the median frequency of the background environment. And this kind of makes sense because bat echolocation is way above the ranges that we're talking about here, above 20 kilohertz. And notice we only had a few sites that even had a median frequency near 10. But that's getting closer to bat hearing. So bats probably perceive these higher frequency sites as louder. Now, one of the ways that bats might be able to deal with noise is they could switch the way they hunt. Mini bats, flexible foraging bats, can use echolocation to hunt moths, or they can use passive hearing, same as we have, to listen to the footsteps of their prey. So we designed systems to test that. We built a robo moth, which is just this spinning little fake wing here, and then we played a mixed tape of katydid and cricket communication calls and insect rustling sounds, and we found this really neat interaction. So it's an interaction between frequency and sound pressure level. So let me kind of walk you through this. So when we're looking at bats that are coming down to the ground and approaching those speakers, as there's two lines here for different frequencies, higher and lower, same on this side. But as it gets louder, they start to no longer approach the speaker. But the rotor, on the other hand, this assay of echolocation ability increases, and separately at each of these frequencies. But it appears as if these animals are switching to echolocation, which makes sense because that is outside of the range of this passive hearing, listening for footsteps, and probably allows them to rescue the cause of noise. So we have some pretty convincing evidence here that bats and birds are directly affected by noise. But what's going on with insects? Are the insects leaving, and that's why the bats and birds are leaving? So is it an indirect effect? So we also measured insects, and we did that to try and understand this whole food web. And we used a variety of different trap types: passive flight intercept traps, pitfall traps, UV bucket lighting traps, beat netting of willow bushes, yellow and blue pollinator traps. And so this is a breakdown of all of that data by effect size. So 0 is no change, and you're seeing 95% confidence intervals in the thin lines, 80% confidence intervals in the thicker. And this is the relationship with sound pressure level. So divining this pattern is pretty complicated, clearly. The overwhelming thing is a lot of groups are not affected, but there's a lot that seem to be increasing in abundance. Now, if we look at the relationship with background frequency, we see sort of not as many patterns, and there are some that are going up and some that are going down, but there are more at the 80% confidence interval and above that are declining. So we kind of have this two kind of pieces of information. The sound pressure level might be indicating that the predators, the insectivores, the bats and the birds leave, and we're getting an increase in abundance. But when the environment is high frequency, which is where insects hear, we might be starting to get direct effects and driving those insects away. And some representative groups to look at are these guys, Placoptera, which are obligate riparian insects, as are Trichoptera. And these are the only two groups that we study that you only find in water, near water, because their life stages are dependent upon it. And again, this is an interaction between frequency and sound level. So these are both saying the same thing, that when the frequency is low and loud, they are attracted. When the frequency is high and loud, they avoid it. So this one potential explanation of this is that these riparian obligate insects are using river characteristics as a habitat selection tool, that they are listening for low frequency, loud rivers. So it seems that we do have this interesting web of connections going on between bats and birds and insects. And of course, at the center of all these spiders. And we spent a lot of time studying these. And I'm only going to give you a taste of this data. And the paper that I'm going to discuss focuses on orb weavers, Tetragnatha and Laranoides. And these two creatures are really abundant in our sites. So we did 4-meter transects at all of the different sites and measured abundance, in addition to capture success, web area, body condition, but I'm not going to talk about any of that data. You can go to Gomes et al. In Functional Ecology to check that out. But what we see is that both of these species are dramatically increasing in sound level. Now, it's pretty complicated to figure out why they're doing it, But when we look at the standardized effect size plot, so these are all directly comparable. So how far away these bars are from zero is indicating how important they are in explaining these patterns. So temperature and wind speed and elevation are known predictors of spider distributions, but notice that sound level is the strongest predictor for both of these species. And interestingly, recent work indicates that orb-weaving spider webs perfectly transduce airborne sound levels. So they're essentially sitting in a giant ear. So they might be able to use that as a habitat selecting tool. So clearly we have a really complicated web of interactions, and we're trying to suss this all apart. And this work we're doing right now, where we captured hundreds of the 6 most common bird species and then collected their guano, and we're currently sequencing that along with our insect collections to try and create webs of understanding so that we can put this whole system together. And I want to leave you with a closing thought, and that is that you might take all of this natural sound work and say, well, I said that natural sounds are doing really similar things to the anthropogenic noise. But the rub here is that loud natural environments are temporally and spatially rare. Most of the world is really quiet, especially at the levels we were studying. Whereas traffic noise and all other types of anthropogenic noise is rapidly increasing and far outweighs the footprint. So our work serves as a call to action for mitigating anthropogenic noise, not a way of dismissing. And I want you to remember through all the studies I've told you that in order to really understand the natural world, we can't just focus on what we see. We have to focus on what wildlife see. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions.
There are some questions in the chat. You can probably see them. Usually I disable that and it's just the Q&A, but it looks like they're in the chat today.
Yeah.
Terry, you can ask them. I can ask them, whatever.
Terry, I think you're muted.
I forgot I muted myself. So the question is, how does noise from interstate and major highways affect bird and bat migration? And then there's more, but I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, so probably quite negatively. And there is some indication that that is going on. So there's a couple of road ecology studies where the workers have quantified the sound level of adjacent roads and shown that migratory birds suffer in those environments. And they have found really similar effect sizes to what we found with noise alone. So it seems relatively convincing that noise is at play there. There's also an interesting connection with light pollution. So most passerines migrate at night, and light tends to ground them, probably from disorientation. So lit roads probably ground the birds, and then they wake up in the morning to rush hour.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a follow-up to that is, how can we modify these habitats to be more noise-friendly for these species?
Yeah. So there's a lot of ways to mitigate noise, and in fact, there's whole entire fields of engineering that focus on reducing noise, both indoor and outdoor. So as a society, we know what to do. And some of those are quiet pavement, noise walls, and then biologically, you can reduce traffic at crepuscular hours, dusk and dawn, when animals are most active and communicating most often. But most importantly, we need to not build any more damn roads.
Okay. What aspects of habitat make it optimal for these animals that are affected by sound?
Yeah, that's, kind of an open question, because so I'm kind of reading into that. Are there ways that maybe a loud place is still a good place? And I think that's totally possible. So if you're a bird that's entirely dependent upon cavities, and the only cavities you can find are in somewhere loud, you're going to do better than if you don't have a place to roost. So that's kind of a hyperbolic example, but there are lots of other habitat requirements for wildlife. But one thing we have to remember, I think, as ecologists and conservation biologists, is that just because you see an animal in a place, it doesn't mean it's doing okay. And it doesn't mean it's habituated. It might mean that it's tolerant, meaning that it has no other place to go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How were the sound levels measured on the Continental maps?
Yeah, that was, I know I covered a lot of stuff there, and it was done correlationally. So there's all of these layers out there for the world and even more for the continental United States. So they took 72 different layers of all of these different things, and using machine learning, they drilled down through all those layers, connected them to these long-term recordings and said, what predicts the sound level where we recorded it, and then extrapolated that across the continent.
Okay. How did you measure the initial abundance of the spiders?
My PhD student, Dylan Gomes, crawled on his hands and knees through tiny streams for years.
Okay. So graduate students is the answer. Okay. Okay, let me see. How were the, okay, that was another, we already did that one in the spiders. Oh, okay. Were there more, Jamie? Okay, that's all I can.
Just do another one. I know I was having issues.
Okay.
It's been sent to me privately. I can ask this one I just sent to you. Given most insects do not have ear organs that can detect vibrational energy, why does the noise directly impact insects? Or was it specifically insect inverts with auditorial sensory systems?
Yeah, so we haven't done the trait-based analyses to directly answer your question, but we have mapped far-field ears and looked at it, and there's no patterns. So what I think it means is we don't know what's going on with insects. So near-field hearing is when particle motion dominates the sound, so you can put your hand in front of your face and feel the air. That's how the cerci, like the little hairs on a cockroach butt, get away from the frog tongue. And all antennae of insects have an organ called a Johnston's organ right at the base that lets insects hear the near field. So it's thought that all insects can hear in the near field, which for very low frequencies can be pretty big, on the order of tens of meters. But now far field is what we think about. Like I can hear a sound a long ways away. But so recent evidence indicates that salticids, jumping spiders, can hear in the far field, and all they have is little hairs. They have no ear. And then orb-weaving spiders can use that spider web as there's no microphone made that can transduce sound as well as an orb-weaving web. So we know so little about how arthropods hear that I don't think we can even answer that question yet.
Wow, that's really cool.
That's the last question I see. If there are any other questions, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A.
Okay. So, of course, I start thinking about hormones and stress. And I know that, when I go into a loud environment, that my adrenaline starts going, and that, I'm getting stressed out. So have you thought about looking at stress levels in the birds or the bats?
So all the birds that we collected guano from, we also collected blood from, and we're in the middle of a telomere analysis, which, as you know, is an integrated way of looking at stress and appears to have more and more efficacy.
Yeah.
And, I think of stress as an integrator and not as a causal mechanism. Because if stress is, if an animal gets stressed out in an environment with no learning, then we're almost certainly talking about an evolutionarily evolved response to that environment, which is essentially that there is a cost. So drilling down and trying to figure out what either that evolutionary driver is or the proximate behavioral driver that they learn to associate that causes stress, I think are far more important than actually saying they're stressed. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So I'm going to follow on that. I've not heard of, I work in a very different area of biology, so telomere length to study stress is kind of interesting to me. Do you do that so that it's not in a moment, but how much stress they've had over a lifetime or a period of time?
Yeah, exactly. So the basic idea is that as the telomere is used up in cellular repair processes, that it shortens over time. And we don't really, and it's very species specific. So trying to compare telomeres across species doesn't give you anything. But within a species, there's more and more studies that seem to be indicating that it can be used as an integrator.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I know they're trying to sell people on measuring their own telomere length as like how chromosomally old you are.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen that, right? What's that company called? Tela years or something?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I don't know. I've not tried it. You have to send in blood. I can't do that. Spit, I can do, but I'm not doing.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And so I guess that's like lifestyle and stressors, diet, all of that, right? Because it's a repair mechanism. Like you said, as your cells turn over, telomeres will shorten and all of that. So that's interesting. I never thought about that for some of what I know what Terry does. I just never thought of other things like markers.
It has been used in birds, so you can measure telomere length, say at the end of the nesting period, and get an indicator of, the stress that they experience during the nestling period, and that has been shown to predict lifespan.
Interesting.
Yeah, so if it's shortened, then they don't live as long.
Yeah.
There's a new set of universal primers that just came out from a member of my department, Eric Hayden, and he's a experimental evolutionary biologist using RNA, but he got really interested in telomeres and how conserved is it. And he's found from like sea squirts to us, you can use the same primers. So it seems to be pretty evolutionarily conserved, which is interesting. That's
really interesting. Cool. Well, I haven't seen any more questions pop up since we've been having this conversation, so we might have covered them all. Wait, I spoke to, oh no, it's a compliment to you. Great presentation and interesting results. Thank you.
Sure, my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. This is our last seminar of the spring quarter, or winter quarter. Sorry, I get ahead of myself. I'm already thinking about the next quarter. Our winter quarter. So thank you so much, Dr. Barber, for being a part of this, and thank you to our audience for joining today. Just check in. Yeah. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Jesse.
Great to see you too. Everybody have a lovely day.
All right. See ya.
Bye.